Now, if you have a procedural programming background, like you've worked with Drupal before and you haven't really worked with object orientation a lot, and you're still feeling some resistance to this because it seems like overkill for supplying what could be just a simple function, let me try to recap exactly what we're getting from using this structure. So if you imagine creating a function that's called blind_date_get_tagline, and we put that inside of our .module file. Now that function is available to us across the entire Drupal codebase. We can access it and get that tagline, just like we can a service, but it seems a lot simpler, right? We have just this function call instead of having to create a service and then register the service with a YAML file and then call it as a service. We could just define a function and call the function, right? Okay, so that does seem simpler, and it is simpler, but here's the things that we don't get from that. First of all, that code is going to be loaded on every single page. So if we use that as a pattern that we're using for all of the utilities that we supply as kind of a public API for our module, then that code will get loaded every single time, even when we don't need it. And most of the time, we won't need it. So with one function, that's not a big deal, but with 100 or 1,000 functions, that starts to add some memory load that we don't need. So the way to get around that is by using auto-loading, which allows us to include files on demand. And the only way to use auto-loading is by using classes. So let's say that you're convinced, okay, I'm going to use a class to wrap around this, and we'll use auto-loading. So whenever we create an instance of this class, it pulls in the file that is responsible for that class. That makes sense. Okay, so we've transitioned now from using a function to using a class. But now, why don't we just call that class whenever we want to? Why do we need to go and register it as a service? Well, the first reason is, what if we want people to be able to override the result of this service? If we were just calling the method directly, then we would force the user to use some other means to manipulate that output or that logic. In this case, we're returning some text, and what if somebody wanted to override that text? Well, they'd have to hook into Drupal after that class was called and we got the text back in order to find where that text is, maybe in a render array or something, and then override it there. If you've ever had to do that before, it's a challenge trying to figure out exactly where the right place to adjust that output. On the other hand, if we use a dependency injection container, then what we do initially is just set up what class aligns with what service. And somebody else, if they wanted to change what that service does, could just swap out the name of that class with the class of their own. So now it becomes dead simple for somebody to override any aspect of our code that we're opening up as an API. And they can do it consistently across different modules because the dependency injection container is consistent. And the second problem that solves is, what if we want to take an instance of our class and use that in multiple places? Sometimes a class can store some data over multiple uses, or maybe we don't want to create multiple instances because, again, each instance of a class that we create will add additional memory load. And so if we decide that we're going to use just one instance of a class and use it across the board wherever we're going to use that class, then we have to find some way to pass that instance around. And probably the way that we do that is by passing it in as a parameter wherever it's needed. And that, if you can envision what that would look like, is going to get messy. The dependency injection container, on the other hand, provides this go-to place where we can expect to find an instance of all of our services. And if the instance doesn't exist, then it will spin one up for us. And that happens behind the scene. We don't even know that it's going on. So, okay, if you're following this logic, then that means that hopefully you're sold on using a class instead of a function, and that you're sold on using a dependency injection container instead of just passing around instances of a class. And so why use Drupals? Why do we need to register it? Why can't we use a dependency injection container of our own? Well, the basic idea is that Drupal provides this API that's this ready-made dependency injection container. For example, if we used our own dependency injection container, we wouldn't be able to access the services in Drupal's dependency injection container as easily. And of course, by using Drupal's dependency injection container, we don't have to manage that whole process. So I know that some of you are still going to be feeling like, I just want to use a function. It's so simple. But hopefully you can come back to this discussion periodically if you start to get that feeling. And refresh yourself in why it is that we're adding this extra complexity. There's really good reasons for it, and it's about as simple as it can be and still provide us the flexibility that ultimately we want long-term for our code.